The ocean stretched endlessly before them, its surface glittering under the setting sun like a field of diamonds. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and flowers, weaving through the rows of white chairs neatly arranged on the warm sand. Every detail had been carefully planned, from the delicate arch of wildflowers to the gentle music that rose and fell with the rhythm of the waves. Emma stood at the edge of it all, her bare feet sinking slightly into the sand, her hands trembling not from fear, but from joy. She wore a simple, flowing gown, the color of fresh cream, and a crown of tiny white blossoms threaded through her loose, golden-haired. When she smiled, it was as if the entire sky smiled with her. Daniel waited by the altar, his heart hammering against his chest. He had dreamed of this moment for years, ever since he first saw Emma laughing in the rain outside the coffee shop where they met. Now, watching her walk toward him, it was as if time itself held its breath. Guests turned in their seats, their faces lit with smiles and shining eyes. The officiant's voice rose above the murmuring ocean, weaving Emma and Daniel's promises into the warm evening air. They spoke of love, of loyalty, of forever, words as old as time, yet somehow new in their mouths. When the vows were exchanged, there wasn't a dry eye among the small group gathered there. As they kissed, the beach erupted in applause, laughter, and cheers. The world seemed to shimmer around them, golden and perfect. The reception began under a canopy of twinkling fairy lights strung between tall bamboo poles. Tables were laden with food and drink, and the music grew livelier as the sky deepened into a velvet blue. Children chased each other along the surf, while the adults sipped champagne and shared stories about love and fate. Emma and Daniel danced barefoot in the sand, spinning and laughing, lost in their own universe. To everyone watching, they were the very picture of happiness, a storybook ending come to life. But just beyond the circle of light, where the beach faded into the shadows of the rocks and the darkening sea, something unseen stirred. A chill, subtle and easily missed, crept along the ground, brushing unnoticed against ankles and toes. The tide began to pull stronger, whispering secrets that no one heard. As the night deepened, Emma slipped from Daniel's arms for just a moment, laughing as she darted away toward the water's edge. "Come find me," she called over her shoulder, her voice bright and teasing. Daniel smiled, lingering a second too long, savoring the sight of her, wild, beautiful, free. It would be the last time he ever saw her. For in that blink of an eye, that fragile sliver of time between heartbeats, the perfect day cracked, the laughter faded, the music faltered, and Emma was gone. At first, no one noticed. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, it all blurred together under the warm, starlit sky. Emma had always been playful, always full of light. It was just like her to slip away for a moment, to chase the tide or twirl barefoot across the sand. No one worried. Not at first. Minutes passed, then more. Daniel wandered through the guests, smiling, searching for a glowing silhouette among the dancers and flickering lanterns. He called her name once, twice, his voice light, teasing, but there was no answer. Someone said they had seen her running toward the water, laughing. Another thought she had gone back to the beach house for a shawl. Excuses layered themselves like soft blankets over a growing unease. Then someone found the footprints, a winding trail of delicate, bare feet pressed into the wet sand, leading away from the celebration. They meandered playfully at first, dipping toward the surf, then curving sharply closer to the waves. But halfway down the beach, where the tide lapped hungrily at the shore, the footprint stopped. Just like that, as if she had simply disappeared into thin air. A hush fell over the party. The music faltered, the laughter died. A murmur rippled through the guests, uncertain and afraid. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the end of the trail, where the last imprint of her foot was already being kissed away by the rising tide. A chill rolled in from the ocean, wrapping itself around him like a shroud. Shouts broke the stillness as guests began to scatter, calling Emma's name into the darkness. Flashlights flickered to life, their beams slicing through the night, scanning the dunes, the trees, the endless, empty stretch of water. The local police were called. They arrived quickly, faces grim, their radios crackling. A search was organized, methodical, urgent. The beach was scoured from end to end. Boats combed the shoreline. Divers slipped into the cold water, disappearing beneath the black surface. But there was nothing. No sign of Emma. No torn fabric caught on a rock. No footprints beyond the last fragile mark in the sand. It was as if the ocean had reached out a hand and plucked her away. Panic turned to dread as the hours dragged on. The joyful chatter of the afternoon was replaced by low, fearful whispers. Mothers clutched their children closer. Friends huddled together, eyes darting toward the dark waves as if they might reveal some hidden truth. Daniel, once so full of hope, now staggered along the shoreline, his calls growing hoarse, breaking into sobs that were carried away by the wind. He would not leave, not while there was any chance she was out there. But deep down, a terrible certainty was already settling in the hearts of everyone on that beach. Emma was gone, and the perfect day had become the beginning of a nightmare no one would ever forget. The flashing red and blue lights cast eerie shadows across the sand, staining the beach in colors of alarm. Uniformed officers moved quickly, speaking into radios, organizing search teams with grim efficiency. Their boots stamped over the delicate footprints that had once been the only clue. The first hours were chaotic. Family, friends, and even strangers who had been drawn by the commotion volunteered to help. They spread out along the shoreline, carrying flashlights and lanterns, their voices echoing across the vast emptiness as they called Emma's name again and again. The ocean responded with silence. Search dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the damp sand. But the salty air confused their senses, and the shifting tides erased whatever faint trace had once been there. The dogs barked and whimpered, restless, pulling at their leashes without clear direction. By midnight, the beach was crisscrossed with footprints, but none belonged to Emma. Tracks led nowhere, forming desperate, tangled patterns in the sand. Daniel refused to rest. He stumbled along the beach, soaked to the knees from wading into the frigid surf, shouting into the night until his voice gave out. Officers tried to guide him back, to make him sit, to tell him to conserve his strength. But he shook them off. He wouldn't stop. Not until he found her. Small boats with mounted searchlights combed the waters offshore, their beams sweeping back and forth in wide arcs. Divers in black suits slid into the freezing sea, disappearing into the depths in pairs. They found nothing. No fabric floating in the current, no torn veil snagged on the rocks, no body drifting in the shallows. Hope, once fierce and blinding, began to fray at the edges. Emma's parents sat huddled together on the sand, their faces pale and hollow. Friends clung to one another, whispering prayers into the wind, willing the darkness to give her back. But as the night dragged on and the first pale hints of dawn touched the horizon, a heavy silence settled over the beach, the kind of silence that comes when even hope feels too painful to hold. Authorities expanded the search area, moving inland toward the cliffs and dunes. But every lead led to nothing. Every clue unraveled into emptiness. It was as if Emma had stepped out of the world completely, leaving no more than a whisper behind. By morning, the beach looked like a battlefield, scattered with abandoned search gear, muddy footprints, discarded blankets, and faces marked by exhaustion and despair. Daniel stood at the water's edge, the hem of his pants soaked and heavy, his eyes fixed on the endless gray line where the sky met the sea. Somewhere out there, he believed, Emma was waiting for him. Somewhere, she was calling his name, and he swore he would not stop searching. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever, until he brought her home. But deep down, a darker thought gnawed at the corners of his mind. What if Emma wasn't lost? What if she had been taken? Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Emma. The beach was silent now, abandoned by the searchers and stripped of its once celebratory decorations. The flower arch had collapsed in the wind. The white chairs were long gone. Only the sea remained, whispering endlessly against the shore, as if mocking their loss. Daniel stayed in the small coastal town, unable or unwilling to leave. He rented a room above the marina, a cold, sparse place with a single window that looked out over the water. Every morning he rose before dawn and walked the shoreline, searching. Every night he stood by the waves until his legs gave out, his eyes red and burning from the salt and the grief. He barely ate. He rarely slept. Grief hollowed him out from the inside, carving deep lines into his once bright face. The wedding photographs remained on his phone, frozen moments of impossible happiness. Emma laughing, Emma dancing, Emma kissing him beneath the arch of flowers. He watched them again and again, until the screen blurred with his tears. But grief was not the only thing that took root in the town. Whispers began to spread, low, insidious things that crept through the narrow streets and over coffee shop counters. At first, people murmured about an accident. Maybe Emma had gone too far into the water. Maybe the tide had been stronger than it seemed. A tragedy, yes, but a simple, heartbreaking accident. But accidents leave traces. And Emma had left none. The theories grew darker. Some said she had been kidnapped, that someone had been lurking among the wedding guests, hiding a terrible plan behind polite smiles and champagne toast. Others claimed it was no stranger at all, that it had to be someone she knew, someone she trusted. Eyes turned to Daniel. Whispers followed him through town like shadows. Had there been trouble between them? Were there signs, things they had missed? A fight, an argument, something hidden behind the perfect smiles? The police questioned him repeatedly. His alibi was airtight, surrounded by guests, seen at every moment, but suspicion clung to him like smoke. Even some of Emma's own friends hesitated when they spoke to him, their voices too careful, their eyes too wary. Daniel felt the weight of it all pressing down on him, the grief, the guilt, the loneliness, and now the poisonous doubt. It crushed the breath from his lungs. It gnawed at what little hope he had left. He knew the truth in his heart. He loved Emma. He would have given his life for hers. But love, he realized, was no shield against suspicion. And as the days wore on and the trail grew colder, Daniel began to fear something far worse than the ocean's pull. Someone had taken Emma, someone close, and whoever it was, they were still out there, watching, waiting. It was a cold, gray morning when the fisherman found it. The tides had been rough that week, churning the waters into a restless, foaming mess. Storms had battered the coastline, scattering driftwood and seaweed in thick, tangled piles along the beach. Old Jim Weller had been walking the shore before dawn, as he did every morning, his boots crunching over shells and debris. He wasn't looking for anything, just clearing his mind, feeling the salt air in his lungs. But something caught his eye, glinting weakly among the rotting kelp and sodden driftwood. At first, he thought it was just a scrap of metal, a bottle cap or a bit of trash washed in by the storm. But when he bent down and pulled it free from the seaweed, his breath caught in his throat. It was a necklace, delicate and silver, with a small, heart-shaped pendant, tarnished now, but still beautiful. And on the back of the pendant, barely visible beneath the grime and salt, was an engraving. "Forever, Daniel." Jim's hand trembled as he turned it over, staring at the simple, heart-wrenching words. He knew exactly whose necklace it was. Everyone in town did. Word spread like wildfire. Within an hour, Daniel was standing on the beach, the necklace cradled carefully in an evidence bag held by a grim-faced officer. Daniel stared at it through the plastic, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the questions being fired at him. Yes, it was Emma's. Yes, he had given it to her the night before their wedding. No, she never took it off. The community buzzed with renewed energy. If the necklace had washed up, maybe Emma was still alive. Maybe she had been swept down the coast by the currents. Maybe she had made it to shore somewhere, lost, hurt, but alive. Hope, once shriveled and brittle, flared back to life. Search teams were organized again. Volunteers walked mile after mile of the windswept coastline, combing through the dunes and rocky coves. Boats set out at dawn and didn't return until well after nightfall. News crews arrived, cameras flashing, reporters shouting into microphones about a new lead in the mysterious disappearance of Emma Clark. Daniel was torn between agony and hope. Finding the necklace felt like reaching out to touch her ghost, a reminder that she had been real, that she had been there, and maybe, just maybe, still was. But late at night, when he sat alone in his small, cold room, Daniel couldn't silence the darker thoughts. Why had the necklace turned up so far from where she disappeared? How had it gotten tangled in seaweed miles down the coast? Had it simply been carried by the tides? Or had someone put it there? Someone who wanted to send a message. Someone who wanted the search to continue, or to mislead it. Hope clung stubbornly to the town like mist. But deep beneath it, a darker current swirled. The necklace was proof of Emma's presence, but it was also proof that wherever she had not gone willingly. In the days after the necklace was found, something strange began to take hold of the town. It started in hushed conversations at the diner, in glances exchanged over grocery counters, in the way fishermen paused at the edge of the docks, staring out at the restless sea. The story of Emma's disappearance had awakened something old, buried deep in the town's memory, something most people had chosen to forget. Whispers turned into murmurs. Murmurs grew into late-night talks behind closed doors. And soon, a chilling tale began to resurface. They spoke of cursed weddings, of ceremonies held on that same stretch of beach where Emma and Daniel had once laughed and promised forever. Long ago, they said, there had been other brides. Beautiful, hopeful women who stood barefoot in the sand, speaking vows to the sound of crashing waves. And then, without warning, they vanished. Always the bride, always the sea. Never a trace left behind. Some said it was bad luck to marry so close to the ocean, that the sea was a jealous mistress, unwilling to share the hearts of those who pledged themselves on her shores. Others whispered of a darker force, an ancient, restless spirit, hungry for young brides, bound forever to the tides. An old fisherman named Marla Simmons, who had lived in the town for 70 years, was the first to speak openly. I was just a girl when it happened the first time, she told a small group gathered in the corner of the marina's pub. Pretty young thing, just like Emma. Married her sweetheart right there on the sand. Folks said it was the happiest day they'd ever seen. Same as now. Marla's voice dropped to a rasp. That night, she disappeared. Just like that. No signs, no screams. Only her veil, caught in the rocks 2 days later. The crowd around her leaned in, shivering despite the warm fire crackling nearby. Others began to add to the legend. A wedding in the 1950s, the bride found weeks later, her body tangled deep in a kelp forest. Another in the 1970s, no body ever recovered, but her shoes washed up 100 miles north. Always the same beach, always the same heartbreak. By the end of the week, The town's mood had shifted. The beaches that once buzzed with summer tourists now sat eerily empty. The inns and cafes pulled their signs inside earlier each night. Children were kept away from the water after dark. Fear curled its fingers around every heart, cold and relentless. Daniel heard the stories, too. At first, he dismissed them as desperate superstitions, the town trying to make sense of something that defied explanation. But late at night, alone with the sound of the ocean scraping against the rocks, he felt a sliver of doubt worm its way into his mind. Was it possible? Could something older, something unknowable, have taken Emma? He didn't want to believe it. But belief, he was learning, was a fragile thing, easily broken by grief, by fear, and by the endless, merciless pull of the sea. It happened quietly, with no fanfare, no goodbyes. One misty morning, just before sunrise, Daniel packed the few things he had left into the trunk of his car. A worn duffel bag, a framed photo of Emma smiling in the sunlight, the crumpled remains of his wedding suit he hadn't had the heart to throw away. He paused once, standing at the edge of the parking lot, staring out over the fog-shrouded ocean. The sea, endless and impenetrable, stared back at him with cold indifference. There were no answers here, only ghosts. Without a word, Daniel slid behind the wheel, turned the key, and drove away, the tires crunching over gravel, the taillights fading into the mist. The town watched him leave, though few dared to stand openly on their porches or sidewalks. They peeked from behind curtains, faces pale and drawn. There was nothing left for Daniel here. Only memories that cut like knives and the endless ache of unanswered questions. Shortly after Daniel's departure, Emma's parents followed. Their once bright eyes had dulled into something hollow, something beyond grief. They sold their little house on Maple Street, packed their lives into moving trucks, and left without speaking to many of their old neighbors. The pain was too great, the reminders too constant. The town, once vibrant with the excitement of a beautiful young couple's wedding, slipped into a heavy, muted sorrow. Tourists still came, some curious about the beach where the tragedy had unfolded, others unaware of the dark undercurrent clinging to the town's edges. But the locals felt it, a shift in the air, a wound that would never fully heal. The beach remained, beautiful and cruel, its sands smooth and untouched, as if trying to erase the memory of that fateful day. But no one forgot Not really. The wedding venue closed its doors for good. The flower arch was left to rot away, its wood brittle and splintered by salt and time. Old Jim Weller, the fisherman who had found the necklace, refused to fish those waters again. He said the sea had taken enough, and on stormy nights, when the winds howled and the waves slammed against the rocks, some swore they heard voices, faint, fleeting, carried on the salt, sweet air. A woman's laughter, a name called out into the blackness. Emma. Life inevitably moved on. Shops opened each morning. Children played in the town square. New weddings were celebrated, though never on the beach. But beneath this surface of daily life, the sorrow remained, like a low tide pulling at their feet, like a shadow stretching across the years. Daniel was gone, Emma was gone, and nothing, not time, not prayer, not even hope, could bring the town back to what it was before. Some scars, they understood now, are not meant to heal. They are meant to remind. Time, relentless and indifferent, continued its steady march forward. 5 years slipped past like the tides, silent, inevitable, pulling yesterday farther and farther away. Emma Clark became less of a memory and more of a legend. In the beginning, there were still posters pinned to telephone poles, still candles lit at the edge of the beach, still flowers left to wilt beneath the weathered wedding arch. But grief, like all things, eventually dulled, and soon, Emma's face was seen only in faded photographs tucked away in drawers, her name spoken only in whispers. She became a ghost story told at seaside bonfires, a cautionary tale for wide-eyed newcomers, sitting cross-legged in the sand, clutching their jackets tighter against the cold night air. They told it the way all stories change in the retelling, details shifting like the restless sea. Some said Emma had been lured into the waves by something she couldn't see. Others claimed she had run away that night, vanishing into the dark to escape some unspoken fear. And a few, the older ones, the ones who remembered, spoke of the curse. The curse of the beach. The weddings that should never have been celebrated there. The sea that always demanded something back. The newcomers would laugh nervously, trying to shake off the chill that ran up their spines. But none of them, not even the bravest, dared to swim at night. The town itself changed, slowly but surely. New businesses opened. New families arrived. The old wedding venue was torn down, replaced by a quiet memorial garden, a patch of wildflowers surrounded by a low stone wall, with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of those lost to the sea." Emma's name was never officially carved there, but everyone knew who the flowers were for. Life found its rhythms again, as it always does. The tourists returned, though fewer than before. The fishermen sailed out at dawn, their boats bobbing like black specks on the horizon. Children raced along the boardwalk, their laughter thin and sharp against the moan of the wind. Yet the shadow of Emma's disappearance never fully lifted. Every so often, someone would catch sight of a pale figure at the water's edge just as the sun dipped below the horizon. A trick of the light, surely, but it was enough to send a fresh wave of shivers through the town. And on certain nights, when the fog rolled thick and heavy over the sand, the old-timers would lower their voices and say, "The sea doesn't forget. It always takes what it's owed." For 5 long years, the ocean kept its secrets. No new clues surfaced. No new answers emerged. Just the steady heartbeat of the waves against the shore, indifferent to human loss. Until one day, when the past, thought buried and forgotten, would come clawing its way back to the surface. And with it, the questions no one wanted to ask, and the truths they were too afraid to face. The storm rolled in without warning. One moment, the sky was a deep, bruised gray. The next, it split open with a roar of thunder so loud it rattled the windows of every house along the coast. The townsfolk battened down their shutters and huddled inside, lighting candles against the sudden, trembling darkness. The ocean turned violent, heaving and thrashing against the rocks, furious and wild. It was the kind of night when no one ventured outside unless they had no choice. Eli Turner, an old fisherman whose hands were as weathered as the driftwood that washed ashore, cursed under his breath as he pulled on his raincoat and jammed a battered hat over his thinning hair. He couldn't afford to lose another boat. Not this year, when the catch had already been so poor. The docks creaked and groaned under the assault of the waves as Eli trudged down the narrow, slick path toward the marina. His flashlight bobbed weakly in the darkness, the beams swallowed by the sheets of rain slashing from the heavens. His boats rocked violently in their moorings, thick ropes straining and whining against the wooden post. Eli moved carefully, checking each knot, tightening where he could, whispering to himself in a rough, steady rhythm, part prayer, part habit. And then, just as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A glimmer, a flicker of light among the rocks near the far edge of the marina, a place where the sea surged in and out, snarling between jagged stones. Eli hesitated. The sensible thing would be to go home. The storm was worsening by the minute, and he was no young man anymore. But the glint was persistent, flashing again, unmistakable this time. Something shiny, caught between the rocks, half submerged by the foaming tide. Grumbling under his breath, Eli picked his way carefully toward it, each step treacherous on the slick stones. The wind howled around him, pulling at his coat, pushing him sideways. Waves exploded against the rocks, drenching him in freezing spray. He nearly turned back. Nearly. But then he saw it up close, truly saw it, and his breath froze in his chest. It wasn't just a scrap of metal or broken glass, as he had expected. It was a bracelet, delicate and beautiful, though battered by the sea. And on its surface, etched in small, elegant script, were letters almost too faint to read in the storm's fury. Eli squinted, shielding his eyes against the stinging rain. And then he read the name, Emma. For a long moment, he stood there, the bracelet dangling from his trembling fingers, the storm raging around him like a living thing. The sea had given up something it had held close for 5 long years. And deep in Eli's gut, colder than the rain, heavier than the crashing waves, a terrible certainty settled. This was no accident. The past wasn't finished with him yet. Not by a long shot. Eli stumbled back from the rocks, the bracelet clutched tightly in his calloused hand. The storm raged on around him, but he barely noticed now. All he could do was stare at the delicate band of silver, impossibly light against the weight crushing his chest. It should have been tarnished, rusted, beaten by 5 years of salt, sand, and relentless waves. But it wasn't. The bracelet gleamed in the meager light of his flashlight, as if it had just slipped from Emma's wrist moments ago, not half a decade past. Eli turned it over carefully, his fingers trembling despite the biting cold. There, etched into the smooth underside, were tiny, perfect letters. EMC, Emma Marie Clark, and below it, in even smaller script, September 3rd, the date of the wedding. Eli's mouth went dry. He remembered that day. Everyone did, the celebration, the laughter, the sudden, soul-crushing silence when Emma had disappeared. 5 years, 5 endless years, and yet here it was, a piece of her, untouched, unaged, as if the ocean itself had preserved it for reasons only it knew. The fisherman's mind raced, torn between wonder and dread. Was it a sign? A cruel joke? Or something worse? Something he didn't dare name under the open sky? The wind shrieked around him like a living thing, and Eli shoved the bracelet into his pocket, as if hiding it might somehow make the reality of it vanish. He needed to tell someone, the sheriff, or maybe Father Cullen at the old church, someone who would know what to do, who could explain how something lost for so long could return looking as if no time had passed at all. But even as he thought it, Eli felt a gnawing sense of unease growing in his gut. The town had spent 5 years grieving Emmett, 5 years building walls around the hurt, sealing it away in silence and superstition. Tearing open that wound now, he shivered, and not from the cold. Still, he knew he couldn't keep it secret. Not when it was her. Not when it could finally bring answers or closure to the family, to Daniel, wherever he was now. Eli made his way back up the rocky path, the storm clawing at his back, the bracelet burning like ice against his thigh. The marina loomed ahead, its lights barely cutting through the sheets of rain. Beyond it, the town slumbered uneasily under the storm's furious lullaby. They had tried to forget, to move on. But the sea, it seemed, had a different plan. As Eli climbed the last few steps, the wind carried something strange, a sound almost lost in the storm's roar. A woman's voice, soft, faint, calling. He froze, heart pounding, but when he looked back toward the rocks, there was nothing. Only the endless churn of dark water and the ghostly hiss of rain against the stones. Clutching the bracelet tighter, Eli turned away and hurried toward the faint glow of town. Behind him, unseen, the waves swallowed the footprints he left behind, as if erasing him from the night itself. By morning, the storm had passed, but the town was anything but calm. Word of Eli Turner's discovery spread like wildfire, carried from door to door, whispered across breakfast tables, and murmured behind shop counters. The bracelet, Emma's bracelet, found after all these years. And not just found, but pristine, untouched by time or tide. It was impossible, unnatural, and the town, still nursing old wounds, stirred restlessly in its uneasy sleep. At the marina, a small crowd gathered despite the lingering drizzle. They came in raincoats and boots, faces pale and drawn, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Some demanded answers, Others simply stared out at the restless sea, as if willing it to confess its secrets. Sheriff Hartwell, now older and grayer than when Emma had vanished, arrived with a heavy sigh. He took the bracelet from Eli with gloved hands, studying it beneath a plastic tarp hastily strung up between two fishing sheds. He said the right words, promised an investigation, said they'd look into it, but anyone watching closely could see the flicker of something else in his eyes. Fear. By midday, the news had reached even the furthest corners of the town. At the diner, regulars abandoned half-eaten plates to gather around a radio buzzing with local reports. At the school, teachers found it impossible to keep students focused, their young minds consumed with visions of the lost bride. Questions, long buried, clawed their way back to the surface. Had Emma been taken? Was she still alive, hidden somewhere, waiting for someone to find her? Or had she chosen to disappear, leaving behind a life and a husband she no longer wanted? Theories multiplied like wildfire. Some blamed Daniel, dredging up old rumors that had never quite died. Others pointed to the old superstitions, speaking of the cursed beach and the pull of the sea. A few insisted they'd always known Emma wasn't truly gone, that she had been out there, somewhere, waiting for the right moment to return or to send a message. The tension wrapped itself around the town like a thick fog. Doors that had long stood open were closed and locked up. Old friends eyed one another with suspicion, and beneath it all, a deeper fear festered. If the sea had given something back, what else might it return? Eli, meanwhile, found himself both hero and pariah. Some thanked him for bringing the truth back into the light. Others blamed him for stirring up old ghosts best left to rest. That night, the bonfires along the beach were lit again, not for celebration, but for protection. Old traditions, half forgotten, reawakened as candles were placed in windows and salt was scattered across doorsteps. The town had lived with its sorrow. It had learned to carry it quietly. But now, the wound was open again, raw and bleeding, and everyone could feel the storm brewing once more. A different kind this time, one that no walls or locks could keep out. The sea had spoken, and the town had no choice but to listen. The town of Seabreeze had tried to bury its past, but the discovery of Emma's bracelet, flawless and glinting with cruel clarity, left them no choice. The police had to act. Sheriff Hartwell, older and wearier now, stood before a small team of deputies in the cramped conference room of the station. Outside, the rain returned, tapping steadily against the windows like ghostly fingers. He cleared his throat, the weight of the years heavy in his voice. "We're reopening the Clark case," he said simply. No fanfare, no drama, only the grim acknowledgement that the past had clawed its way back to the present. Files were dusted off, photographs unfurled from yellowing folders. Old witness statements, many barely legible now, were pulled and spread across the table like a grim mosaic of loss. The interviews began the next morning. One by one, those who had attended Emma and Daniel's wedding were called back in. Some came reluctantly, some eagerly, unable to resist the allure of old gossip made new again. The stories were familiar, at first. "I saw her walking toward the water," said an old neighbor, wringing her hands. "I thought she just needed a moment alone. I heard shouting by the dunes," a groomsman added, "but it was windy. Could have been anything." "I remember," said a bridesmaid, trailing off, her eyes glassy with the strain of reaching into the past. But as the questioning deepened, details began to shift. Small things, things that hadn't seemed important 5 years ago. One woman remembered seeing a second set of footprints alongside Emma's, veering away from the shoreline, prints that disappeared into the tall grasses beyond the beach. A bartender confessed he'd overheard a heated argument between Emma and an unknown man the night before the wedding. Not Daniel, he swore. And a teenage guest, dismissed at the time as confused, insisted once again that he had seen a woman, soaked, shivering, and barefoot, wandering near the cliffs the night Emma vanished. She looked scared, he said, voice trembling. But when I called out, she just disappeared. The new information was murky, fragmented. Time had blurred the edges of memory, but it had also stripped away some of the fear that kept people silent. Back then, the town had wanted closure. Now the truth, messy, complicated, and frightening, demanded to be heard. Sheriff Hartwell stared at the mounting pile of reports, his jaw tight. This wasn't going to be easy. Emma's disappearance wasn't the simple tragedy they had convinced themselves it was. It was something more, something darker. The sheriff called Daniel into his office that afternoon. They sat across from each other, the silence between them thick with unspoken regrets. Things might come up, Hartwell said carefully. Things you won't want to hear. Daniel met his gaze, the fire of 5 years' worth of grief and guilt burning in his eyes. I don't care, he said. I need to know. Outside, the rain grew heavier, blurring the world beyond the windows into a shifting, uncertain haze. And somewhere out there, buried beneath years of silence and salt, the truth waited, patient and hungry. The town had awakened. Now, there would be no turning back. The rain hadn't let up in days. It fell in a relentless mist that blurred the edges of the town, turning streets into rivers and hills into ghostly shapes. In the cramped front office of the Seabury Sheriff's Department, a frail woman stood, wrapped in a thick wool coat that looked older than the building itself. Her name was Margaret Holloway, a lifelong resident of Seabury's, though she lived mostly in solitude now, in a crumbling house near the northern cliffs. Her hands, veined and trembling, clutched a wet handkerchief as she spoke to Deputy Lane. I have something to say, she said, voice thin but urgent. Something I should have said a long time ago. Within minutes, she was seated in the back of the station, a cup of lukewarm coffee trembling in her grip. Sheriff Hartwell and Daniel listened closely, every muscle in their bodies taut. I saw her that night, Margaret said, her cloudy eyes fixing on a spot just beyond them, as if the memory was a vision she couldn't escape. Emma. Margaret nodded slowly. I live up on the bluff, you know. I could see the beach from my porch. That night, I was out late, couldn't sleep. Her hands tightened around the cup. There was lightning on the horizon. Just little flashes, but enough to see shapes moving down by the water. She swallowed hard. I saw her. Emma. She was running. Daniel leaned forward, barely breathing. Running? Toward the cliffs. Margaret nodded again. And she wasn't alone, she whispered. There was someone chasing her. The room seemed to grow colder, the hum of the overhead lights suddenly deafening. Could you tell who it was? Sheriff Hartwell asked carefully. Margaret shook her head, frustration flickering across her worn face. It was too dark. I only saw the shapes. Hers and someone bigger, faster. They were close. Too close. Her voice dropped lower, trembling. I called out. I yelled for them to stop, but the wind took my voice. And then they were gone. Gone where? Daniel asked, voice rough. Over the edge, Margaret said, closing her eyes. Over the cliff. A heavy silence fell. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The only sound was the relentless ticking of the old wall clock, each second a hammer blow against the thickening tension. Why didn't you come forward before? Hartwell finally asked, though he already suspected the answer. Margaret opened her eyes, and for the first time, they shimmered with tears. I was afraid, she whispered, afraid no one would believe an old woman, afraid of what it might mean. She reached into her coat, and pulled out a small, weathered notebook, pressing it into Daniel's hands. "I wrote it down that night," she said. "Every detail I could remember. I didn't want to forget. I thought, maybe someday." Daniel clutched the notebook as if it were a lifeline. Outside, the storm began to intensify again, the sea beyond the cliffs churning like a living thing. Emma hadn't simply vanished. She had run. She had been chased. And somewhere on that cold, wild night, something terrible had happened. The truth was closer now, so close they could almost touch it. But as Daniel stared out the rain-fogged window, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened 5 years ago was far from finished. In fact, it might just be beginning. The notebook Margaret had given Daniel was a beginning, but it was not the whole story. Over the next several days, he buried himself in the past he thought he had shared with Emma and discovered cracks he had never seen before. At first, it was small things. An old journal tucked into a forgotten box in their storage unit. Photos where Emma's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Letters addressed to no one, written late at night in shaky, hurried script. But the deeper Daniel dug, the darker the picture became. Emma had been hiding something she had never trusted him enough to share. At the bottom of a locked drawer, one he remembered asking her about once, years ago, and being brushed off with a laugh, he found the first real piece of evidence. A bundle of letters. Old, yellowed, and tied together with a frayed black ribbon. The handwriting was jagged, desperate. "You can't escape me. I know where you are. You belong to me." Each letter was unsigned, each one more threatening than the last. They dated back months before the wedding, some even earlier. Daniel's stomach twisted as he read through them, rage and fear warring inside him. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she suffered in silence? More disturbing still, Daniel realized the letters had escalated right up until the week of the wedding. The last note, the one that made his hands go cold, was short, almost a whisper on the page. "If you go through with it, I will come for you." The date stamped on the envelope was 2 days before the ceremony. Daniel sat back, the blood roaring in his ears. Someone hadn't wanted Emma to marry him, and someone had made sure she didn't. Sheriff Hartwell listened grimly as Daniel laid out the letters on the sheriff's desk later that evening. "This changes everything," Hartwell said, his voice low. "We assumed it was an accident, maybe even a suicide. But this was a threat," Daniel finished for him. "A promise." Hartwell rubbed his temples, the weight of guilt heavy on his shoulders. "I'll reopen the interviews," he said. "We'll cross-check every guest, every worker at the wedding. Someone there knew. Maybe someone helped." Daniel nodded, but his mind was already spinning faster than the rain outside. The guest list had been large. Family, friends, co-workers, strangers. Anyone could have slipped and died. Anyone could have been watching. The idea that the danger had been so close, laughing, drinking, dancing alongside them, made Daniel's skin crawl. He had been blinded by love, by the idea that they were untouchable. Now he saw the truth. The enemy hadn't been a distant threat. The enemy had been right there, on the sand, under the perfect blue sky, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As he left the sheriff's office that night, Daniel felt the cold air bite at his face. The ocean roared in the distance, dark and endless. He clutched Emma's letters tighter. The past was no longer buried. It was rising, and Daniel knew, with bone-deep certainty, that whoever had haunted Emma back then was still out there, watching, waiting. Emma's childhood home sat on the outskirts of Seabreeze, long abandoned since her parents had left town in the aftermath of her disappearance. The once bright shutters now hung crooked. The garden was a wild tangle of thorns and weeds. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of time and sorrow. Daniel stood on the front porch, the key, rusty but still fitting, trembling in his hand. The door creaked open, releasing a stale gust of air heavy with dust and old memories. Inside, everything was frozen as if her family had simply vanished one day and never returned. Photographs still lined the mantel. Emma as a laughing child, her parents smiling beside her. Trophies, books, little mementos of a life that once brimmed with promise. Daniel moved through the room slowly, each step stirring motes of dust into the dim light. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, A clue, A sign. Anything. It was in Emma's old bedroom, a soft, faded pink with peeling wallpaper, that he found it. While pulling aside a loose floorboard beneath the window, Daniel's fingers brushed something soft and battered. A small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. He pulled it free, heart pounding. The first pages were innocent enough, diary entries from a girl on the cusp of adulthood. But as he turned further, the handwriting changed. It grew sharper, more hurried, less about school and friends, and more about fear. I saw him again today. One entry read, "Outside the library, watching me." Another, "The letters keep coming. I don't know how he finds me. I don't know what he wants." And then, "I can't tell Daniel. He would only worry. I have to handle this myself." Daniel's throat tightened as he flipped to the final pages. They were different, more fragmented, almost frantic. Half the words were scratched out. Whole names had been ripped from the margins, leaving jagged wounds in the paper. One entry, dated just a week before the wedding, sent a chill through his blood. He says he'll be there. He says I can't run anymore. Someone I trusted helped him. Someone close. I don't know who to believe anymore. Daniel stared at the torn pages, the missing names. Someone Emma had trusted. Someone they had both known. Had the enemy been closer than either of them had imagined? He thumbed carefully through the back of the journal and found something else. A small piece of paper tucked between the binding. It was a torn photograph. Daniel recognized it instantly. A group shot from their engagement party. Family, friends, neighbors, smiling, arms around each other, drinks in hand. But someone's face had been carefully, meticulously burned out with the tip of a cigarette. Charred edges framed an empty void where a face should have been. Daniel's stomach churned. Whoever that person was, Emma had feared them enough to erase their image entirely. The storm outside the house picked up, rattling the loose windows and sending a low moan through the hollow rooms. Daniel clutched the journal to his chest and stood still, listening. For a moment, he could almost hear her voice. A whisper. "Find the truth, Daniel." He turned and hurried from the house, the journal hidden under his jacket. There were answers here, buried deep in fear, betrayal, and secrets torn from the past. And now, no matter how much it hurt, he would find them, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of the people and the love he thought he knew. The search had taken to the sea. After Daniel turned over Emma's torn journal and the charred photograph to the authorities, Sheriff Hartwell agreed. They had to look deeper, literally. A dive team was assembled, made up of volunteers from Seabreeze and a few professionals from neighboring towns. It was risky. The waters near the cliffs were known to be treacherous, hidden rocks, powerful currents, and sudden drop-offs. Still, something in Margaret Holloway's story, and now Emma's journal, pushed them forward. Emma had run toward the cliffs that night. Maybe the ocean, so vast and merciless, still held the final pieces of her story. The day the divers set out, the sky was heavy with mist. The sea churned with a restless, whispering energy. Daniel stood on the beach, watching as the small boat carrying the team bobbed and disappeared into the fog. Hours passed. Radio chatter crackled occasionally through the sheriff's portable receiver. Reports of visibility, of rocky outcrops, of the endless, eerie silence under the waves. Then, mid-afternoon, a call that sent a shock through everyone on the shore. "We found something." The voice was tight, barely containing the edge of disbelief. Hartwell leaned toward the radio. "Say again." "About a quarter-mile south of the cliffs. 20 feet down. It's a boat, Sheriff. A small one. Burned. Half sunk into the silt." Daniel's heart thudded painfully in his chest. A boat. No vessels had been reported missing the night Emma vanished. No accidents, Doc. No fires. If a boat had gone down that night, someone had hidden it. And if they had hidden it, what were they hiding? The dive team surfaced slowly, pulling pieces of wreckage onto the deck. The boat was badly damaged, char-black, its hull cracked and splintered. But some parts had survived. A twisted bit of railing, the outline of seating, now eaten away by salt and flame. And near the bow, half buried in mud and barnacles, a shattered nameplate. Only 2 letters were still legible. CA. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sheriff Hartwell squatted beside the wreckage as the team laid it out on the shore. Daniel stood a few feet back, a cold, familiar dread curling in his gut. Could it have been hers? Daniel asked, voice low. Hartwell shook his head slowly. Emma didn't own a boat. Neither did her family. And none of the wedding guests reported one missing. He ran a gloved hand along the blackened wood, frowning. This boat wasn't supposed to be found. Daniel stared at the wreckage, his mind racing. Had Emma been forced onto this boat that night? Had she tried to escape? Or had it been used to take her somewhere she didn't want to go? And what about the fire? An accident? Or a desperate attempt to erase the evidence? The dive team promised to return the next day, to search the area more thoroughly. But as night fell and the mist thickened, an uneasy truth settled over Seabreeze. Emma's story wasn't buried deep at sea, It was still dangerously close to the surface, waiting like something alive just beneath the waves. And Daniel knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened that night wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel didn't want to believe it, not even as the pieces slid into place with a sickening, inevitable certainty. The burned boat. The missing face in the photograph, the letters Emma had hidden, filled with terror. And the partial name on the wreckage, CA. There weren't many boats registered in Seabreeze starting with those letters. Only one stood out, Catalina, a small fishing vessel once owned by none other than Mark Holloway, Daniel's best man. His oldest friend, the one who had stood beside him as he spoke his vows, the one who had toasted Emma with a smile that now, in Daniel's memory, looked just a little too tight. Fueled by a fury he barely contained, Daniel found Mark at the local bar, the Siren's Call. The place was nearly empty, save for the bartender and a couple of old men nursing their beers. Mark sat hunched over a drink at the corner of the bar, his shoulders tense, his eyes dark and hollow. As Daniel approached, Mark seemed to sense it, lifting his head slowly, his face pale under the flickering neon lights. "You here to finish me off?" Mark muttered, voice slurred by more than just alcohol. Daniel didn't answer. He grabbed Mark by the front of his jacket and shoved him against the wall with a force that drew a startled gasp from the bartender. "You lied to me," Daniel hissed, "all these years." Mark didn't struggle, He just let out a bitter, broken laugh. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know enough," Daniel growled. "I know about the boat. I know about the letters. I know you were at the cliffs the night she disappeared." Mark's eyes filled with something, fear, guilt, or both. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," he said hoarsely. "I just wanted to talk to her. Make her understand." "Understand what?" Mark's mouth twisted. "That she belonged with me. That you didn't deserve her." Daniel's world tilted, rage blinding his vision. "You were my best friend. I loved her." Mark exploded, shoving Daniel back. The bar went silent, all eyes on them. Mark's chest heaved, years of secrets finally clawing their way out. "I love her before you ever knew she existed," Mark said, his voice cracking. "But she picked you. She always picked you." Daniel stood there, heart hammering. Mark wiped at his face, his hands trembling. "I tried to scare her, make her think twice. I sent the letters. I followed her, yes. But that night wasn't supposed to happen." Daniel's voice was a low growl. "What did you do, Mark?" Mark slumped against the wall, defeated. "I met her by the cliffs. I just wanted to talk. She got scared, ran toward the beach. I chased after her, but she slipped. She fell. I swear, Daniel, I didn't push her. And the boat." Mark's face twisted in agony. "I panicked. I thought I thought if I got rid of the evidence, they'd never find out. So I torched the Catalina and sunk it. The weight of it all crashed down on Daniel. Years of mourning, years of questions. And the answer had been right there, smiling in photographs, standing at his side. He turned away from Mark, disgusted. "You destroyed everything," Daniel said. Mark didn't respond. He just slid down the wall and buried his face in his hands. Outside, the storm rolled closer, dark clouds pressing low against the sea. But Daniel barely noticed. The real storm was already here, and it wasn't over yet. The next morning, Daniel sat alone at the edge of the cliffs where Emma had last been seen. The sea below crashed against the rocks, wild and relentless, just as it had that night 5 years ago. Mark's confession had filled in some of the missing pieces, but not all. There were still gaps, shadows between the facts. Daniel pulled Emma's torn journal from his coat, running his fingers over the cracked leather. She had been afraid. She had known someone close to her was dangerous. She had tried to fight back in her own quiet way by planning an escape. And somehow, that night, when everything spun out of control, she had made a desperate choice. Sheriff Hartwell had quietly shared what the divers found yesterday evening, something he hadn't wanted to make public yet. A piece of torn white fabric wedged between rocks beneath the cliffs. Silken lace, part of a wedding dress, tattered by the ocean, but still stubbornly clinging to existence. Emma had fallen, yes, but not from the highest point, where the drop would have been certain death. From a lower ledge, a place where if she were lucky, if she were strong enough, she could have survived the fall. The path below the cliffs led toward the water, toward the open sea. Daniel stared out at the endless horizon. There had been no body, no definitive sign of her death, just footprints leading to the shore. And now, the bracelet, found 5 years later, gleaming as if new. It didn't make sense if she had died that night. It suggested something else. Survival. Escape. Maybe, after slipping from Mark, Emma had seen her one chance and taken it. Diving into the sea, letting the ocean carry her away from the life she could no longer trust. Daniel closed his eyes against the burn of tears. The town still whispered. Some said Emma's spirit haunted the beach, a bride lost to the waves. Others believed something simpler, that Emma, clever and strong, had swum away under the cover of the storm, vanished to start anew somewhere the past could never reach her. Daniel didn't know what he believed. He only knew that love wasn't always a beautiful vow spoken under a bright sky. Sometimes it was letting go. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, Emma's bracelet, the one the old fisherman Eli had found. Delicately, he walked to the cliff's edge and leaned out over the sea. For a long moment, he hesitated. Then, with a whispered goodbye, he let it fall. The bracelet spun once in the air, catching a stray beam of sunlight, and then vanished into the waves below. The ocean, vast and unknowable, swallowed it whole, just as it had swallowed Emma's final secret. Daniel stood there until the sun slipped behind the clouds and night crept in around him. Whatever had happened that night, wherever Emma had gone, whether into the arms of freedom or into the cold embrace of the sea, one thing was certain. She had chosen her fate, and Daniel finally could choose his. It was time to let her go. The town of Seabreeze gathered one final time on the beach where it had all begun. Word had spread quickly about the wrecked boat, the torn dress, the hidden journal, about the truths uncovered and the ones that would forever remain lost to the tides. Nobody could say with certainty what had happened to Emma Calloway, but everyone agreed. She deserved to be remembered not as a mystery, not as a ghost story, but as the vibrant, fearless woman she had been. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. A soft breeze stirred the air, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers that some of the townsfolk had woven into simple garlands. Daniel stood apart from the crowd at first, hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn jacket, staring out over the endless stretch of ocean. They had built a small memorial, just a simple stone marker etched with her name and the words, "Gone, but never forgotten." There were no sermons, no long speeches, only quiet, heartfelt moments. People placed shells, flowers, and small tokens at the base of the stone, tiny reminders that Emma's story, though marked by sorrow, was not defined by it. Sheriff Hartwell, standing stiffly beside his wife, bowed his head. The old fisherman, Eli, set down a piece of driftwood carved with Emma's initials. Even Mark's mother came, weeping softly, though her son remained conspicuously absent. Finally, Daniel stepped forward. The crowd fell silent. For a long moment, he said nothing, the words heavy in his chest. Then he raised his face to the wind, his voice low but steady. "Emma," he said, "wherever you are, I hope you found peace." His hand brushed the bracelet charm he had kept on a chain around his neck, a tiny anchor once meant to symbolize the future they were supposed to build together. He unclasped it now, letting it fall into the surf at his feet. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything I couldn't protect you from, for the life we didn't get to live." The waves pulled at the charm, drawing it gently into the sea. Daniel closed his eyes. Maybe she was out there somewhere, living under a different sky, a different name, Da. Maybe she watched the same sunrises, listened to the same call of the ocean. Or maybe she had become part of the sea itself, her spirit dancing in the tides, whispering in the mist that curled over the water. Either way, Daniel knew she was not lost. She was free, and now so was he. The crowd slowly dispersed, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Daniel stayed behind a little longer, listening to the sound of the waves, the rhythm steady and eternal. He turned away at last, walking up the shore toward the village. As he did, a warm gust of wind rose up from the sea, brushing against his face like a caress. He smiled through his tears. Somewhere, somehow, maybe Emma was listening, and maybe, just maybe, she was smiling too.